A woman of amazing stamina, built-in sense of identity and an awareness of what her responsibilities were.
She really believes in bright colors because she has said, I need to be seen to be believed, and she knows she's a diminutive person. So when she goes out, she's always in that monochromatic pop of color.
This was a huge epic moment for the monarchy, and it really signals this transition to a new reign. Charles has never stepped in at a major constitutional event of that magnitude.
From the Zoomerplex in historic Liberty Village, the Zoomer with Marissa Lennox.
Welcome to the Zoomer. I'm Marissa Lennox. She's the longest reigning British monarch in history, not to mention the longest serving female head of state ever. And she's preparing to mark the 70th anniversary of the day she came to the throne. On today's show, a look back at the Queen's life and some of the most historic moments of her reign. And royal expert Richard Berthelson joins me next to dish on all the pomp and circumstance planned for the big Platinum Jubilee celebrations. But before we dive in, let's tee up the topic.
In 1952, Queen Elizabeth II ascended the throne. By 2015, she'd earned the distinction of longest reigning British monarch, surpassing Queen Victoria's of 63 years, 7 months, and 2 days. She is currently on her 13th Canadian Prime Minister, 14th U.S. President, and 7th Pope. From visiting more than 120 different countries to giving royal assent to more than 3,500 acts of parliament, her successes are endless. But above all, that the Commonwealth stands ever taller, growing from just 8 members to 54 today, has been the Queen's crowning achievement.
Joining me now, a man who has served 4 governors general and lieutenant governors and has helped organize royal visits since 1978. Richard Berthelson, it is so good to have you here.
Pleased to be here.
So let's just start with, why is this such an important moment for the royals and for the British people?
Well, you know, a Platinum Jubilee has never come along before. 70 years of someone doing one job is extraordinary. And, you know, the Queen is now almost the second longest reigning monarch of all time in the world. And she probably will reach the ultimate record, which was Louis XIV, when she achieves, if she goes as long as 72 years, which she may well do. So this is a real epic moment. But what we're also seeing in this Jubilee, unlike the last 3 Jubilees that the Queen has marked, is it really is the beginning of the end of the second Elizabethan age. And so we are seeing a long farewell and a real transition to a new reign. So it's very, very different than the previous Jubilees.
Well, let's talk first about the Jubilee itself. Do you think there will be much pomp and circumstance, or do you imagine it'll be a little bit more subdued just because we're coming through COVID? She just lost her husband. What do you think?
It's going to be different because there will be some reticence by some members of the public to showing up in great numbers because people are not necessarily feeling comfortable about that yet, thanks to COVID. Also, the Queen herself will not be participating in a great number of events during the Jubilee, especially the principal week, June 2nd through the 5th in the United Kingdom. She hasn't toured the Commonwealth this time. She didn't either for her Diamond Jubilee. So the guest of honor won't always be there, and she may not be there on the day because she's going to make a decision on a day-by-day basis.
Right.
So it is a really different sort of thing. That said, people who will tune into the great events in London will see pomp and circumstance around her official birthday. On the first day, there'll be a reflective moment at St. Paul's Cathedral with a service of Thanksgiving. But there'll also be some fun and frivolity on the last day with a pageant down the mall, which I think will be extremely lively and very, very interesting for people to watch.
I imagine this day brings, or this milestone brings, mixed emotions for the Queen, because while it is the day that she assumed the throne, it also coincides with the death of her father.
Right. Her accession day in February is a very melancholy day because that is the day her father died. So she never has huge celebrations. There are always time for June when weather is better in London, and it is actually the anniversary of her coronation that they center around, which is a much more celebratory moment. But the Queen has said that, you know, in a life, a very long life, you pass a lot of milestones, and she's never sought to do that. And she's been forced a few times to kind of reflect on her longevity and as if she's trying to rack up the number. She really doesn't see it that way. She sees herself as having been called to this, you know, by God. She took an oath to God in terms of her coronation to serve her all of her years. And this is just what happens. And so, you know, she doesn't, I don't think, see this as an achievement, but she sees this as an opportunity to celebrate with the people, and that is the key to her reign.
Now let's talk a little bit about Harry and Meghan. They've announced that they will be attending the celebrations, but they won't participate in that photo op, the trooping the color on the balcony at Buckingham Palace. What went into the decision to limit them?
Well, you know, Prince Charles has said that he felt the monarchy needed to slim down, and so the trooping the color, the balcony appearance, has had up to 50 members of the family. So it's not just Harry and Meghan that are being excluded this time. It's about 25 others. But the
Prince Andrew?
Well, yes. The principal issue that the royal family is trying to deal with on that balcony appearance is making clear that Prince Andrew will not be there. So the Queen and Prince Charles have made the decision that only working royals, that is to say, people who are actually out representing the Queen on royal duties, will be on the balcony. So it's going to be a much slimmed down group than it's been before. Some people will be disappointed, but I don't think there's a lot to read into it beyond that.
So it's not, so you think it's more about Prince Andrew and less about the royal family snubbing Harry and Meghan, or is it a case of the Queen protecting them from, say, being booed, for example, because their reputation has taken a hit?
In the UK in particular, I do think that the concern is to really focus the royal family and this moment on all those people who are making the contribution, and the others will not be part of that big moment. That's not to say they won't be at other events, but they can't be on the balcony anymore.
How do you think they'll be received by the British public, speaking of reputation?
Yeah, their reputation has taken a big hit in the UK. I mean, there's a lot of people that see kind of inconsistencies or hypocrisy in some of the things that have been said, particularly in the Oprah interview, which did not go over very well in the UK. And some of their conduct also really riles people up, especially at a time where the Queen is, you know, so frail, and yet they're not there helping out, really.
But then there's also talk of this Netflix documentary and the cruise. I mean, how big of a concern is that?
I don't think it is. I think the Netflix documentary, as I understand it, is focusing largely on Harry's work with Invictus, which has probably been one of the most successful things he's done, and I think it will probably limit itself to that.
All right, we saw Charles step in for his mother for the state opening of Parliament. This isn't the first time he's had to do that. Do you think it's a case of really his mother's health declining, she can't physically be there, or what's going on?
Well, this was a huge epic moment for the monarchy, and it really signals this transition to a new reign. Charles has never stepped in at a major constitutional event of that magnitude, and I thought it was there was a real melancholy and somber feel as he was kind of looking at the crown, which represented the absent monarch on that occasion.
Yeah, there was.
I think there's two things going on. The Queen herself has mobility issues. It would have been a very difficult ceremony for her to walk through. And maintain her dignity, which is really clearly quite important to her. The second thing is that the longer this happens where Charles is filling in for her and seen publicly doing that, the public is getting used to seeing him in the role of the king. So the Queen is actually, in a way, performing her ultimate service to the institution and the crown, which she's served so faithfully her whole life, by kind of orchestrating this transition where he's seen as doing the job. And I think it's really changing how the public is perceiving him and how they see his role going forward. And we're going to be used to it by the time he becomes king.
Now, before I let you go, you have had the privilege of meeting the Queen. What is she really like? Because I heard one person say her personality and who she really is her greatest paradox.
That's right. I mean, it couldn't be more true. You really meet someone who you are not expecting at all, because she's quite funny, quite cutting in her humor. She's extremely sharp. She notices everything, including whether you've shined your shoes. And you can kind of tell if you haven't, that she sort of looks at you and with that eye. And she's, you know, she's great fun. And she's, you know, really got a sense of what's going on and often has read her brief and knows the questions to ask. But she's always putting people at ease with little comments. And it's quite bracing because you see this very stoic, dignified person who we don't hear speak a lot personally in interviews or things like that. And you really are meeting someone who's quite different.
Fascinating. All right, Richard, it's great to have you here. When we come back, the panel joins me next. Welcome back to our special coverage of the life and legacy of Queen Elizabeth II. Let's bring in the panel now. The former Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, David Onley, Dr. Carolyn Harris, and Nathan Tidridge. It's good to have you all here. I want to start by rolling some tape because this is a pledge Queen Elizabeth, then Princess, made at the time of her 21st birthday. So let's roll that.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. But I shall not have strength to carry out this resolution alone unless you join in it with me, as I now invite you to do. I know that your support will be unfailingly given. God help me to make good my vow, and God bless all of you who are willing to share in it.
David, I'll start with you. How true was she to her word?
Oh, absolutely, completely true. And imagine this was when she was 21. Now, I'm not sure what you were doing when you were 21. I was at Scarborough College. I think I was fretting and worrying about whether or not a girl I had my eye on was going to go to an event with me, and what I was going to do in terms of selecting courses for the fall. And that was about it, Of course, I wasn't sitting there as she was with the understanding, and she would have known this from a child, basically, that upon the death of her father, she would become the monarch. And, none of us at all have had that sense of responsibility on our shoulders, say from early teenage years, where it would really start to sink in. But there she was, making that declaration.
It's so true. Carolyn, she's such an institution. It's easy to forget that she wasn't supposed to have become queen at all. Take us back to, when she began her momentous reign.
Well, when Princess Elizabeth was born in 1926, she was the eldest granddaughter of King George V and Queen Mary, but her father, the Duke of York, later King George VI, was the second son, not the eldest son. And at that time, it was still expected that the baby princess's uncle, the future Edward VIII, might marry someone suitable and have children of his own. And of course, if Princess Elizabeth's parents at that time had a son, he would supersede his sister in the succession. So there were all sorts of different possibilities for Princess Elizabeth, where she might have been a cousin or a sister of a monarch rather than the monarch herself. But with the abdication of her uncle Edward VIII in 1936, her father becomes King George VI, the name George VI symbolizing continuity with George V, and the public eye is very much focused on Princess Elizabeth. She had a younger sister, Princess Margaret, but it was fairly clear there was not going to be a younger brother, and that she was the heiress presumptive to the throne. She did not expect to become queen as early as she did.
Right.
Her father, King George VI, suffered from lung cancer, but when Princess Elizabeth and her husband, Prince Philip, left for Kenya in 1952, he was there at the airport waving to them. So it came as quite a shock when they received the news, February the 6th, 1952, that it was time to return to the United Kingdom.
And she was so young, Nathan. Carolyn touched on it, but is there anything in her life that could have possibly prepared her for something so monumental? Was she prepared at the time? Obviously, it came sooner than she thought.
Yeah, that is a very young age to be making such an oath. But the tradition in the family would have been to prepare for a life of service and that apparently she was had a very close relationship with her father, and that he was preparing her for that. But again, it was much too soon.
David, the Queen spent a lot of time here over the last 70 years. She's made no fewer than 22 visits to Canada, as I understand. What would you say was her most significant visit to the country?
Wow, it's very hard to say. I suppose the last one, because people were aware. It just coincided with my term as lieutenant governor. But she was at an old enough age that there was active conversation as to whether or not this was likely to be her last visit, and that turned out to be true. Now Prince Philip came back one more time, but I think everyone perceived that this was her last visit. Still a woman of amazing stamina. My wife and I, along with Premier McGuinty and his wife and other dignitaries, were at Pearson Airport on the tarmac. It was a blisteringly hot day while she departed and got on the Canadian government jet. And I recall vividly how we departed ourselves, went to grab a quick bite to eat, and then head home, respective homes. And when we got home, I turned on the TV set, and there she was, speaking live at the UN. And I just shook my head. I thought, wow, what stamina this person has to wrap up the tour, get changed on the plane, get to the UN, and then give an address. And as Nathan just said, it is this built-in sense of identity and an awareness of what her responsibilities were.
All right, we need to take a quick break. We'll be right back on the other side. Welcome back. In a speech marking the 40th anniversary of her accession to the throne, Queen Elizabeth described 1992 as an annus horribilis, a Latin phrase which means horrible year. 2 royal divorces, the publication of Diana's tell-all memoir, a fire at Windsor Castle, but worse was to come. 5 years later, on August 31st, 1997, Diana was killed in a car crash. There's no question, Nathan, that these were some of the most tumultuous years of her reign. In your view, how was she able to steer the family and the monarch to calmer waters?
Well, I think it goes right back to that speech that she made 75 years ago, where she centers service and service to others. And she's this kind of steadfast rock at the center of it. And by keeping that focus and very honestly pursuing that focus, she kind of kept the ship afloat as it navigated through those waters. I mean, that's part of the royal family. They're a family. And but unlike our families, their trials and tribulations are public, and they become public property very quickly. And so not only is she having to be head of state of the UK and 13 other nations, she's also having to be head of a family, and all of it is in front of the camera.
David, how would you say Diana's death in particular impacted the monarchy and the royal family?
Yes, it's a very good question, because in the immediate days after the death, the severe criticism from the public that the royal family and the Queen in particular were not appropriately mourning the death of Diana. And, outside of the fictional treatment, there's certainly enough documentary evidence, memoirs, etc., that the Queen took that all into account and gave an address that was very appropriate for the times, and made that subtle but very important, if you call it mid-course correction, in the portrayal of emotions, the portrayal and the exhibition of concern to others. I mean, we know that the Queen had demonstrated that on various occasions, in moments of national tragedy in the UK. But this was very different, because it was the wife of her son and the mother of her 2 grandsons.
You saw those pictures of the Queen there when the casket was going by and she was bowing her head. Well, of course, the Queen bows to no one. Now, almost 30 years later, Carolyn, her lifetime of public service is facing another test. Yes, she just lost her husband, but Prince Harry and Meghan have laid bare their rift with the royal family in an interview with Oprah. Her son, Prince Andrew, is embroiled in scandal. How would you say these things are threatening the institution?
Well, it's important to keep in mind that both Prince Harry and Prince Andrew are second sons. They are not directly in line to the throne. So there's been a very strong emphasis in the royal family's public image on continuity and on the senior members of the royal family, as the press has been very focused on Prince Andrew's legal settlement, Harry and Meghan stepping away from their duties as senior members of the royal family. And it seems that in response, there has been this focus on the direct line and the royal family's immediate future.
But she still faces challenges. Nathan, the move by Barbados to remove the monarch as head of state has sparked questions over how a monarch can continue to oversee a Commonwealth agitating for change.
Well, you have to take it on a country by country basis, because each country that recognizes the Queen as the head of state is an independent Commonwealth realm, and so completely politically, militarily untethered from the United Kingdom. For this country, for Canada, we're the only member of the Commonwealth that is constitutionally entrenched the crown, the monarchy, in our democracy. So as far as the longevity of the institution, in an age where democracy seems to be under threat, Canada remains I think a dedicated constitutional monarchy. The institution has served the country very well, so well that in fact that it's entrenched at the very core of our system of government.
Okay, and I'll get reaction from David and Carolyn as soon as we come back from this short break. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back. The Modern Commonwealth and Queen Elizabeth grew up together. She made the Commonwealth her priority, and under her stewardship, it grew from just 8 members to 54 today. It is arguably her crowning achievement. So, David, talk a little bit about the Queen's role in the Commonwealth and how it's evolved to where it is today.
Well, you've just hit the nail on the head in terms of just the pure mathematics of it, growing from 8 nations to 54. And you see the difficulties and the bitterness that exists between nations on the planet. You have to say to yourself, well, okay, so it's an old style entity. There's no powers that it has to enforce rules or regulations, but these are interacting nations who are not at war and frankly setting a strong example for the rest of the nations on the planet. Does that make the situation in the Middle East any better? No. Does it make the Russian-Ukraine situation any easier to untangle? No, it doesn't. But it does set an example of what is possible.
Now, we saw the Commonwealth tour taken by William and Kate most recently, Carolyn, and it was reported in the media that there was this sort of semi-colonial feel to it. It did receive a lot of criticism, particularly the images of William and Kate on top of a Land Rover sort of waving. So, you know, I'm curious your reaction to that trip, how you felt about it.
Royal tours often harken back to previous tours, and we see that in speeches where there's allusions to relationships that were formed with people or institutions in previous tours, previous generations of the royal family who were present. So that scene at the military review on a Land Rover waving to the public, that scene was meant to be reminiscent of the Queen and Prince Philip previously having used that same vehicle on their Caribbean tour. Znaimer in the 1950s. So this was meant to honor the Queen's Platinum Jubilee by having one of those set piece events associated with the Queen's reign. But unfortunately, in the 2020s, the optics of some of these particular set piece events that have been hallmarks of the royal tour do not go over as well, particularly in the press and with some commentators analyzing these visits. So we noticed with Charles and Camilla's recent tour of Canada, the focus was very much on what's topical in 2022, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, climate change in the Arctic, opportunities for young people and veterans, meeting with Ukrainian Canadians at this time when Ukraine is facing this invasion by Russia. So we see that there's more of an emphasis as the Platinum Jubilee tours unfold on current events rather than as many of the big set pieces that have been hallmarks of previous royal tours.
I think it's also important for us to keep in mind that those events are done at the request of the hosting government. So that royal tours are designed, constructed by the government who hosts them. So the request to inspect the Jamaican Armed Forces, use of the Land Rover, and all of the details of that event would have been done by the Jamaican government. And it's for the members of the royal family to follow the advice of their governments. It's the same thing with the Prince of Wales here. He can't come to Canada unless he's invited to by the government of Canada. And the tour itself and the details and the people that he meets are really in the control of the government. Which particularly with Indigenous folks, I think is problematic and something that needs to be addressed here in Canada.
David, do you think that we'll see more countries go the way of Barbados? I mean, it's one thing to be part of the Commonwealth, of course, but to have the Queen as their head of state.
I think there's a certain degree of inevitability, but what it really comes down to is that in terms of Jamaica and in terms of Barbados and the other Caribbean nations, we're just dealing with not two levels of government. We're dealing with one elected level of government. And to remove the Queen as head of state in those nations, it's a simple, straightforward vote up and down, yes, no, just like any other piece of legislation in those countries. In Canada, it's a very different situation where to remove the Queen or the King as head of state requires unanimous approval of not only the 10 provinces, but the territories as well, and a majority vote in the House of Commons. So you just have to say to yourself, is there a single person alive who can remember any issue whereby all 10 provinces and the federal government have all agreed on anything? And the answer is no. So I would think that there would be others in the years ahead, but perhaps not as many as people might think.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. David Onley, Carolyn Harris, Nathan Tidridge, it's good to have you. Suzanne Boyd, editor-in-chief and publisher of Zoomer Magazine and everythingzoomer.com is up next. Welcome back. My next guest is the editor-in-chief and publisher of everythingzoomer.com and Zoomer Magazine, where Queen Elizabeth has appeared on the cover 6 times in exclusive portrait photos, illustrations, and even as an effigy on the side of a coin. Suzanne Boyd joins me now to talk about the Queen's life and legacy. So first of all, does the Queen hold the record for most Zoomer Magazine covers?
Absolutely, and shouldn't she? She's the Queen.
Let's talk a little bit about some of these covers. Do you remember this one?
This one, yes. This is an exciting cover because this picture I'd never seen before. Celebrating one of her, she has had so many anniversaries and so many milestones, but one particular one, they invited a bunch of Commonwealth photographers to photograph the Queen, and one of them happened to be Bryan Adams, who is also the great rock star, but also a fabulous photographer and also a contributing editor at Zoomer. And we had already ran the photograph of her sitting in the mudroom laughing, and the Queen never laughs. You don't see that often. And we had run that as an exclusive earlier on. And when Prince Philip was about to retire from royal life, her strength and her stay, as she put it, and Bryan said, well, I have another picture of her with Prince Philip from that shoot. And I said, you do? Like, what? And he goes, well, I wanted her standing behind him because that's how he was represented in life, 2 paces behind. And I said, that's so lovely. would you do me the great honor of allowing me to publish this photograph? And he agreed to do it. So I really love this one. It was such a gentle, it talked about their royal love story. Romancing the Throne was the cover line, and that one was, it's close to my heart. I thought it was very sweet.
Well, let's talk a little bit about her legacy. 7 decades on the throne. What would you say is her greatest achievement? Like when you think back on her history, what will you remember?
I think preserving the monarchy and making it relevant, keeping it relevant as she hands it off to Charles. And I think, you know, there was very touch and go during her reign. The Diana situation almost toppled the monarchy. She had to pivot really quickly with the Prince Andrew and the Harry and Meghan leaving situation, which brought up the, you know, the whole question of colonialism and racism, which is, you know, let's face it, a lot of what the British Empire was built on, and the monarchy represents the British Empire. So I think she's been very nimble during her time by preserving the institution of the monarchy and the customs, but being able to pivot when she needed to.
You're so right. Even when she inherited the institution, it was pretty vulnerable, right?
Yes.
And so what are some of the ways, like let's drill down on that. What are some of the ways she was able to modernize the monarchy, to keep it relevant, to your point?
Well, I think the first thing she did was be completely authentic all her life, be true to herself. So when she gave that speech at 21 from South Africa, that famous speech that for as long as I live, you know, my duty I will serve you, and she actually did that. She never stopped doing that job. And I think, but she knew, like I think the biggest sign when she knew things had to change was after the Annus Horribilis, during the Annus Horribilis, as she called it, when Windsor Castle burned down after 3 of her children's marriages had broken up, even though she's the head of the Church of England and they don't believe in divorce and that sort of thing. She agreed to pay taxes, because when Windsor Castle burnt down and people saw all those great, you know, paintings and all the richness that was flowing out of Windsor Castle, and the royal family paid no taxes, she's one of the richest women in the world, then she agreed to pay tax. I think the other thing she did was after the brouhaha with Diana and the royals staying up in Scotland and not coming down and speaking to her people, the flag wasn't up at Buckingham Palace because she wasn't in the palace, but the crowd took it as, why aren't they lowering the flag for Diana? So she came down from Scotland and she put the flag up and lowered it. But then when Diana's casket went by on the way to the funeral a week later, she actually stood outside and bowed her head to the casket. The Queen bows to no one. And then shortly after that, her mother died. Then the crowd again was on her side, and she won them back over.
Well, you mentioned the 90s and the fire at Windsor Castle, the royal divorces,
yes,
and then, of course, the death of Princess Diana.
Yes.
What do you remember in the aftermath of that event?
Just how shocking the whole outpouring of emotion from the British public was, because, you know, there's always been the stiff upper lip, you know, keep calm and carry on. And it's like the whole country had a nervous breakdown. And then the rise of Tony Blair, because when he came out in front of the cameras and talked about the People's Princess, then that really cemented him as a man of the people too. And he sees the narrative from the royal family. And I think that was really the ascension of Tony Blair as a cultural figure, as a social figure.
Now, I want to play you a clip that our colleague Libby Znaimer did with the author of the Palace Papers, Tina Brown, and then I'll get your reaction. I'll get your reaction when we come back. So let's roll that clip.
In my book, you know, I talk about, you know, the refrain at Buckingham Palace after Diana's death was never again. And by never again, they meant we do not want to have somebody who comes in and becomes so powerful and so with her popularity and so famous and celebrated that essentially she's bigger than the monarchy. And that's what was happening. That did happen with Diana.
So Diana was out there. She had her own power base. And then 20 years later, Meghan comes along with her own celebrity appeal. You know, do you think to some extent when she came along, there was an element of she was doomed from the very beginning just because the royals had worked so hard to get beyond that celebrity factor?
I think it was unfortunate that the royal family didn't use that celebrity and charisma because, you know, we're not celebrities is their mantra, because we're about duty and service. And even the Queen, she signed her last statement, your servant, Elizabeth. I mean, you know, it's that bowing backwards to say we're not privileged. But the fact is we do live in a celebrity culture, which is personality driven. And the Queen herself is a celebrity. That's why she jumped out of the plane with James Bond at the London Olympics. She was playing off her celebrity. For brand Britain, obviously. And I think what was really explosive about the Meghan thing was, apart from how well presented she was, her looks, the way she spoke, her communication skills, her obvious intellect, was also the fact with Harry, the playboy, dashing soldier prince, it became really combustible. And I think it was up to the royal family to harness that and use it to their benefit. And I think with the way their leaving went down, and I don't like to call it Megxit because it blames her, I like to call it Hexit. I do feel that if the royal family had just bent a little, because why couldn't they do the half in, half out, really?
The last few years, no question, have been turbulent for the royals. Obviously, the rift between the two brothers, the Oprah interview, Prince Andrew, of course. How do you think that's shaped the monarchy and impacted the monarchy and its foundations?
I think it's really shaken it, and I think that's why the people are so concerned with the reign of Charles, because he's not the popular figure his mother is, and he's not the popular figure his son is. So he's kind of the king in waiting, but also the transitional figure to go, because he's still of that older generation. And I think it's going to be tough. I think what Charles has going for him is that he was ahead of the curve on so many things. Like when he was considered like a nutter, talking to trees, organic farming, environmentalism, proper urban planning, setting up the Prince's Trust for youth in crisis. You know, he's done all this amazing work. And I think the world has sort of caught up with him. I think it's going to come down to the respect for the institution, because whoever is next just gets the crown. Your point of the fact that it's been so shaken by these horrible scandals as basically on the Queen's way out the door in the twilight, let's say it better, at the twilight of her reign, it's not good. And I think what you've seen her doing is trying to shore it up by the statement about Camilla. You wouldn't expect that from her, but to put out a statement like that was quite extraordinary.
All right, stay there. We'll be right back with more after this break. We're back with Suzanne Boyd, editor-in-chief and publisher of Zoomer magazine and everythingzoomer.com. Now, one of the most interesting evolutions of the Queen's cultural impact can be seen in the fashion industry. How did she put her stamp on fashion?
Well, she's done it all through her reign in different ways. So when she first became queen, she was the dashing, beautiful, young, waist-waisted, society beauty. And you have all those gorgeous, photos of her and Princess Margaret, mind you, in these beautiful Norman Hartnell gowns. They wore Christian Dior. And then her wedding dress, it started the craze of royal wedding dresses because it was right after the war, 1947, when she married the dashing, Greek heir, her distant cousin, mind you, Prince Philip. And that dress, because it was still wartime and rations, people were sending in ration cards. So, her cake could be made and the dress, she'd have the fabric for the dress. So her dress was a sensation. And in the 60s and 70s, she was very high fashion. You see her on these royal tours wearing turbans and cat-eyed sunglasses and being very, very dashing and chic, the white gloves. And she did that for a couple of years. And then in her middle years, she came to Canada for one tour and she was considered dowdy. Everyone said she looked dowdy and tired. Oh. And that was in the 80s, 90s. And then after that, she just got this new look, which is the look we now remember. It's the monochromatic look, bright color. It's matching coat and dress, the shoes, which are handmade for her. And then broken in by her dresser, Angela Kelly, who wears them first.
So she has someone on her staff that wears her shoes first?
It's a woman called Angela Kelly, who is the keeper of the Queen's wardrobe, and she's very close to the Queen. The Queen has authorized her to write books, actually, about her style and her wardrobe. And one of Angela Kelly's jobs is to wear the shoes first. So when the Queen wears them and does the walkabouts, she doesn't get blisters, even though they're handmade and probably cost thousands of pounds. Her hat is never over a certain height, so when she gets into the car, it won't bounce on the top. But she really believes in bright colors because she has said, I need to be seen to be believed, and she knows she's a diminutive person. So when she goes out, she's always in that monochromatic pop of color. And it's created like, it's kind of Warholian, right? It's just the replica. It's iconic silhouette because you don't even have to see it, you just have to see the shape and there's the Queen.
Does she wear British designers?
She wears clothes that are made for her by Angela Kelly, and she has certain seamstresses that, designers, sewers, seamstresses, I don't know if that's the word you use these days, but who makes dresses under the direction of Angela Kelly. And they buy fabric that they have stored for like decades, and that's put down for when the Queen needs something made, and then they use that fabric.
People have surmised what she carries in her bag.
Right.
Do you know?
Well, we know for sure lipstick, because we've seen her take it out and put it on in public. Like ever so often she's sitting at some, she'll put on her lipstick, so we know that. They say not money, but she's been seen to actually buy ice cream for Prince Edward once using money from her bag. I think the most important thing about the bag is that it's always the same style, and I forget the name, but we have it, we know what it is. But she uses the bag to signal certain things. So if she wants to stop a conversation, she moves it up her arm. If she wants to leave an event, she puts it in a certain place. So she uses the bag as like her bat signal for her aides and her ladies in waiting to know when she wants to stop a conversation or go somewhere, which is kind of fun.
That is funny.
It's really fun.
You know, she's a really interesting woman because she's been able to work well with 14 different prime ministers in Britain. What do you think that says about her character when we live in a world that's so divided politically, that she was able to work well with people of different political stripes for her entire life?
Well, constitutionally, they have to work with her, right? So, I think it's part of just the duty, and she's been known to put her thumb on the scale in certain political things where she lets it be known, or she says something in a walkabout, like about with the Scottish independence referendum. Charles has gotten in trouble for writing letters to various cabinet ministers about politics, and it was revealed. But the Queen is, you know, she's old school, never complain, never explain. She never speaks. She's never given an interview. She's spoken on camera, but she's never given an interview. So she keeps her own counsel. And the fact that one of the covers we had was her sitting at the desk with that her famous red box, where she reads everything. And you know, she's always been a working woman. She's been a working woman all her life, and she's committed to that, and that's her job, to deal with these prime ministers, give them advice and consent, and she's known to be very well informed.
Meanwhile, she is the paradigm of health and wellness. How has she changed the face of aging?
Oh, remarkably so, because that's one of the reasons I think our audience loves her. I think about 12 years ago, we did a story, The Secrets of Royal Longevity, and it's still one of our biggest. We update it every so often, obviously, along with all our other massive amount of royal content, but that's part of it. I mean, so right now, she's not doing certain things because of mobility issues, but she's still working.
Yeah.
Up to 2 years ago, even a year ago, she was riding horses, not side saddle, riding horses. Up to 3 years ago, we saw her driving herself around Windsor. So I think that's really part of the fascination. And, you know, she's lived this life as an outdoors woman. I think people say if she wasn't the Queen, she'd want to be a country woman raising horses, right? So she walks, you know, she rides, she drinks barley water, apparently. That's why her skin's so good every morning. And I just living that idea, the Zoomer philosophy of engagement and wellness and being just part of the world around you and never sort of stopping, I think she personifies that.
A good point to end our discussion on, Suzanne. Thank you, as always. That's it for time. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week.